For more than 150 years, Pompeii's most famous victims told a heartbreaking story. A mother shielding her child, sisters embracing in their final moments, families huddled together as death swept through the city. Millions saw these plaster casts and believed they were looking at the last acts of love and sacrifice. But when scientists finally looked inside the casts using DNA technology, they discovered something nobody expected. The stories that survived for centuries were wrong. And what the victims were actually hiding would completely change how we understand Pompeii. On August 24th, 79 CE, life in Pompeii appeared normal. The bustling Roman city sat near the Bay of Naples beneath the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. Merchants filled the markets. Children played in the streets. Wealthy citizens gathered in elegant villas decorated with colorful frescoes. For generations, the mountain looming over the city had been little more than part of the landscape. Then, everything changed. Shortly after midday, Vesuvius erupted with unimaginable force. A massive column of ash, gas, and volcanic rock blasted into the sky. At first, many residents believed they had time to escape. Some did. Thousands fled into the countryside as ash began raining down on the city. Others stayed behind. Throughout the night, the eruption intensified. Roofs collapsed beneath the weight of falling pumice. Streets disappeared beneath layers of volcanic debris. Panic spread as darkness consumed the city, but the worst was yet to come. In the early hours of the morning, Vesuvius unleashed a series of pyroclastic flows. These deadly waves of superheated gas and ash raced down the mountain at incredible speeds. Temperatures may have reached as high as 500 degrees Celsius. Nobody caught in their path stood a chance. Within moments, Pompeii was transformed into a silent graveyard. And yet, strangely enough, the disaster preserved something that almost no other ancient tragedy ever could. It preserved people. For centuries, the victims remained hidden beneath layers of hardened volcanic ash. When archaeologists began excavating Pompeii, they discovered something extraordinary. Many of the bodies had decomposed over time, but they left behind hollow spaces inside the hardened ash. These empty cavities preserved the exact shape of the people who died. In 1863, Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli came up with a revolutionary idea. Instead of simply excavating the voids, he poured liquid plaster into them. When the plaster hardened and the surrounding ash was removed, something astonishing emerged. Human figures, men, women, children, entire moments frozen in time. Some appeared to be sleeping. Others looked terrified. Some seemed to be shielding loved ones. A few appeared to be embracing each other in their final moments. These casts quickly became some of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history. Visitors looked at them and naturally created stories. The cast of an adult protecting a child became known as a mother, making the ultimate sacrifice. Two figures embracing were interpreted as sisters or close relatives, sharing their final moments together. Groups found sheltering beneath staircases were assumed to be families desperately trying to survive. The stories felt obvious. The poses seemed to tell everything, or so everyone thought. For generations, researchers focused primarily on the casts themselves. They studied clothing, jewelry, body positions, facial expressions. But there was one problem. Most conclusions were based on assumptions. The plaster revealed what the victims looked like. It did not reveal who they actually were. As technology advanced, a new generation of scientists began wondering whether the casts still contained hidden information. What if the victims had left behind more than just their shapes? What if fragments of their biological identity were still trapped inside the plaster? It sounded almost impossible. The eruption had occurred nearly 2,000 years earlier. Any surviving DNA would be incredibly fragile. Yet researchers decided to investigate, and what they found would overturn decades of accepted history. Scientists selected a number of Pompeii's best-preserved casts for detailed analysis. Instead of relying on traditional excavation methods, they turned to advanced medical imaging technology. Powerful CT scanners examined the interiors of the plaster figures layer by layer. For the first time, researchers could see inside the casts without damaging them. The results were remarkable. Hidden within the plaster were fragments of human remains, tiny pieces of bone, vertebrae, finger bones, ribs, material that had remained sealed away for centuries. These fragments offered something archaeologists had never truly possessed before: a chance to identify the victims themselves. Researchers carefully extracted microscopic samples. The process required extreme caution. Any contamination could ruin the results. Every sample was cataloged, protected, and analyzed using modern genetic sequencing techniques. Then the first DNA profiles began to emerge. What they revealed shocked everyone. One of Pompeii's most famous casts showed an adult positioned near a child. For over a century, historians believed they were looking at a mother protecting her son or daughter. The story appeared obvious. The adult wore valuable jewelry. The pose suggested protection. The emotional interpretation felt natural. Then the DNA results arrived. The adult was not female. The individual possessed XY chromosomes. The supposed mother was actually a man. Even more surprising, genetic analysis showed no close biological relationship between the adult and the child. The heartbreaking story that generations had accepted simply wasn't true. The jewelry had helped create the misunderstanding. Modern observers often associate gold bracelets and decorative accessories with women. But in Roman society, wealthy men frequently wore elaborate jewelry as symbols of status and influence. A simple assumption had transformed an unknown individual into a heroic mother. The DNA erased that story entirely. And it wasn't the only one. Another famous cast depicted two individuals locked together. For decades, visitors and historians described them as sisters or close female relatives. The image became one of Pompeii's most emotional symbols. It seemed impossible to interpret the scene any other way. Yet once again, science told a different story. DNA analysis revealed that one individual was male, the other was female. Even more importantly, they were not closely related. The embrace remained real, but the story surrounding it disappeared. Nobody knows who they were. Friends, acquaintances, strangers. Perhaps they simply ended up beside each other during the chaos. The eruption happened so quickly that thousands of people were thrown together in unpredictable ways. The emotional image survived. The explanation did not. Then researchers turned their attention to another famous group. 4 individuals discovered together beneath a staircase. For years, they were presented as a family seeking shelter during the eruption. The interpretation seemed reasonable. People naturally assume that groups found together must share some connection. DNA testing revealed otherwise. No close biological relationships existed among them. Their ancestry markers differed significantly. The group was not a traditional family. In fact, they may have had no connection at all before the disaster. Once again, a story that felt obvious turned out to be wrong. And by this point, a disturbing pattern had emerged. The casts were not revealing history. They were revealing how modern people interpret history. The DNA findings did more than correct a few mistaken identities. They exposed a much larger truth about Pompeii itself. For generations, many people imagined Pompeii as a relatively local Roman town, populated primarily by native Italians. The genetic evidence painted a completely different picture. Many of the individuals studied showed ancestry connected to regions far beyond Italy. Their genetic signatures linked them to populations from the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, Greece, Egypt, and the Levant. Suddenly, Pompeii looked less like an isolated Roman city and more like a global crossroads. This should not have been entirely surprising. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents. Merchants, soldiers, slaves, craftsmen, and travelers moved constantly between distant provinces. Goods from across the Mediterranean flowed through Roman ports every day. People did too. The DNA simply provided direct evidence. The city buried by Vesuvius was far more diverse than historians once imagined. The victims trapped within the ash represented a world connected by trade, migration, and empire. The DNA study did not merely identify a few individuals. It challenged the way people interpret the past. Human beings naturally build stories from incomplete evidence. We look at poses, expressions, objects, locations. Then we create narratives that feel right. The victims of Pompeii became symbols of motherhood, family, sacrifice, and love. Some of those interpretations may still contain elements of truth, but the DNA revealed an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the past is far stranger than the stories we invent. What seems obvious often isn't, and the more advanced our technology becomes, the more hidden assumptions begin to collapse. The victims of Pompeii spent nearly 2,000 years silently waiting beneath volcanic ash. When scientists finally listened to what their DNA had to say, the dead told a completely different story. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. If some of archaeology's most famous stories turned out to be wrong, how many other accepted historical truths are still waiting for their own DNA test? Thanks for watching. Do not forget to subscribe for more history mysteries hidden beneath the surface of the ancient world.